Hello again, I am Blunty. Third-party controllers. At some point in our lives, we've all been forced to use one, right? Especially if you're a second sibling. I am a first sibling. I'm the prime sibling, so I was never forced against my will to use a cheap and nasty third-party controller. But if you were, that's today's question for the comment section down below. What is the absolute worst third-party controller you were ever forced to use? What system did it go with? Do you remember the brand? Who made you use it? It's time to name and shame these horrific people forcing their younger siblings to use crappy, cheap third-party controllers. This is not a crappy, cheap third-party controller. This is a third-party controller, but it's neither crappy nor cheap. I mean, it is less expensive than Nintendo's own, but it doesn't feel cheap. It might very well be a very worthy controller, and we're going to find out in today's review. This is the PowerA Enhanced Wireless Controller for Nintendo Switch. It'll cost you 50 Biden bucks, and God, I'm so happy I can say that instead of Trump bucks. It has a couple of drawbacks, one plus, and a couple of washes when compared to Nintendo's own homegrown controller. If you've got the budget to reach for Nintendo's own, it may not be the prime choice you can make, but if you're on a budget or if you're looking for a secondary controller, this, well, spoiler alert, but the review is quite positive. I like it. Let's find out why. And as we're finding out, I would also appreciate if you just take a quick swing down below and do the thumb, the sub, the bell, and the comment you're already leaving about the misery forced upon you in your youth versus crappy third-party controllers. Right, the PowerA Enhanced Wireless Controller for Nintendo Switch. First off, design. I have it here in their Pikachu Black Gold Edition. Now, I personally am not usually a fan of controllers with fancy pattern or character prints. They're usually kind of crappy looking and often just slap on some stock artwork with no consideration for how it works with the controller's shape and button layouts and the like. Even PowerA do this sometimes, as you can see here with their Mewtwo with a thumbstick coming out of a compromising position. I personally tend to prefer a simple and cleaner color set, like the two-tone variations that the Xbox controllers tend to come in. That said, I do genuinely like the art on this one. I think it looks good on the controller, even in the absolutely ostentatious metallic gold paint splash style here. Because let's be fair, it is a little over the top, isn't it? They also have this in a whole swath. Is that the right word? Swath. I'm using it anyway. A whole swath of various other design choices as well with the exact same guts in. If Gold Splash Pikachu isn't to your taste, they've got a Doom one and a Zelda one and a whole variation of different Pokemon ones. And yes, they're all properly and fully officially licensed and stuff. There's no dodgy stuff going on here. When it comes to weight and general feel, it's ever so slightly lighter than the Nintendo Pro controller and practically identical in shape and layout. The thumbsticks are just slightly smaller in diameter, but their height is identical. They move the same way, they have the same travel distance, and they have a relatively deep concave top as opposed to Nintendo's own rimmed shallow dome. And I actually prefer this style. I find that concave cap is a less slippery, more positive feeling grab for my thumb. Their movement resistance is very slightly stiffer too, but not so much as you really notice in gameplay. The button feel is both sharper and more resistive than Nintendo's too. It takes a bit more force to activate them, but they're basically identical in feel thereafter. Travel, tactile click, sound when pressed, it all feels very close to Nintendo's own. The function buttons for plus, minus, home, and screenshot all stand a bit prouder than they do on the Pro controller, which are almost flush, which I like. It makes them easier to locate by feel, but they're also easier to press. But as your thumbs never actually rest on them during gameplay, this isn't really an issue for accidental activation. One trick the PowerA has that Nintendo don't, see what I did there? Call back to an old ad. Hands up in chat if you recognize that one. One trick that this doesn't do is it has extra buttons on the back there. These are fully programmable buttons, nothing too fancy, just a pair of flush fit fingertip buttons on the back of the grips. These are programmable to any of the face buttons, including the stick clicks and the D-pad directions. The buttons themselves rest in a very well-placed spot, easy to use without adjusting your grip awkwardly, but unobtrusive and unlikely to be accidentally pressed if your grip tightens up during a stressful gameplay moment. So that's the extra functionality. What about what's missing? Well, firstly, and this may be a deal breaker for some people out there, there's no rumble here. Now, I'm a kind of take it or leave it guy when it comes to Rumble. Most games don't use it in a very interesting or useful way. Some games even use it in very distracting ways. Racing games, oh, you're driving across the gravel, or, shooting games, you're getting shot, not very interesting, not very useful for gameplay wise. You can already tell what's going on by, looking at the game. Some games use Rumble in more interesting and useful ways and tie it deeper into gameplay. Like, for example, in Animal Crossing, when you're fishing, I find my reaction time for fishing is faster when I feel the rumble versus looking for the splash or listening for the sound that happens when you've got a fish on the line. In games like Immortals Phoenix Rising, they use the rumble in a really interesting way when it came to the map screen and locating locations and items and chests and things like that. As you would pan across the map with your icon, when you would get close to it and go, yeah, and it would, give you a big buzz when you're right on top of it. So it helps you locate that stuff in a very sort of intuitive and very immersive kind of way. I liked that. But not having Rumble doesn't necessarily break those games. They do have other indicators as well. They're just not quite as sort of visceral, I guess, maybe is the word. So whether or not the fact that Rumble is missing from this is a deal breaker for you is entirely up to you, your own personal tastes, whether or not you can live without it, what type of games you play, and how integral the vibration feature is in those games. For me, in some games I'm going to miss it. In other games, who cares? Less important, though, is another missing feature, and that is the fact there's no NFC reader in here, which means no amiibo functionality. Now, when I was preparing this review, I was trying to remember the last time I actually scanned in an amiibo to a game, and I literally couldn't remember. It was probably Breath of the Wild 2.5 years ago, maybe more, the last time I played that to any extent. I didn't even use it with Animal Crossing, and that's one of the more recent games that has significant, although not vital, amiibo and NFC functionality in it. Aside from that, I get shrug, nothing, I don't know. So I doubt whether that is going to be a deal breaker for many people out there. Even if it is, it's not like you're using amiibo constantly throughout a game anyway. So if you have a point where you go, oh, I want to scan an amiibo, you just switch over to the Joy-Cons for a second, do the amiibo thing, and then switch back to this and continue your gameplay as normal, right? It does, however, keep a feature that I have seen missing from some other third-party controllers, and that is the gyro. The gyro! And it works very, very well, in fact. It feels transparently identical in responsiveness and sensitivity to Nintendo's own motion sensors, so that's beautiful, actually. Battery life is another area where Nintendo is hard to match, let alone beat, because the Pro Controller has like 40 hours of battery life, and it really does live up to that in real-world conditions. This has a significantly lesser battery life. However, it is still significantly more battery life than you'll find on most controllers out there for any system. By anybody's standards, 20 to 30 hours is an extraordinarily good battery life, so zero complaints there. And I have a whole new context for battery life in today's age of gaming, because as of late last week, I am now officially a somewhat proud owner of a PlayStation 5. It took me 70 days just to get an order in, and don't even get me started. But yeah, this thing, PlayStation controller, depending on how aggressively it uses its fancy, force feedback triggers and other functions on the controller, the battery life on this can be as little as 4 to 6 hours. That's atrocious. It has no particular relevance to this review, I know, but it's been bothering me for several days now, since the instant the PlayStation landed on my doorstep, and I just needed to get that off my chest. PlayStation 5 owners out there, facing the same issues? I mean, it's not every game. It's not every game. Some games last, maybe 6, 7, 8 hours pretty easy. Monster Hunter's pretty kind to the controller because it doesn't use the other features very... But let's get back to this, shall we? Now, it's all well and good to have a nice fancy print if you're a particular fan of a particular game series, like Pokémon, for example. But how good is the print? Well, it feels pretty good. There's a coating on it, which should protect it from being scratched off. How well this puts up over time with sort of your hands rubbing against it constantly on the controller grips, and whether or not it's going to get chipped off if you drop it or bump it around and things like that, that's only something time will tell on a controller like this. I can't really talk to that. I will say it is from PowerA. They're a pretty good brand. They've been around for quite some time now doing their thing, so I doubt whether they're cutting too many corners, and quality-wise and manufacturing-wise, they've probably got things nailed down pretty well by now. So I doubt whether it's going to be an issue about looking ratty real quickly over time. Same goes for longevity. I doubt that this thing will fall apart in 6 months' time. It's probably going to last you a decent amount of time. I have a reasonable amount of confidence in that, just by the brand's general reputation. But overall, it is a damn good controller. Perfect? No. Ideal if you don't already have a Pro controller? Maybe not. If you have the budget, I would still go for Nintendo's Pro controller as your prime controller. But if you are on a budget, this is a very good controller. Or if you're looking for a secondary controller and you don't want to spend big on the, another one of those for something that's not going to get used all of the time, this is also a very good option for that. In fact, it's probably the best third-party Nintendo Switch controller I've come across so far. So if you are on the lookout for a cheaper and or secondary controller, definitely stick this on your list to have a peek at. But thank you for watching. I am Blunty. Hopefully you found this useful, entertaining, informative, any of those adjectives. And as always, thank you to the patrons scrolling up above there for your above and beyond support. For the rest of you, you can support the channel in doing comments, the thumb, the sub, the bell. If you haven't done any of that and haven't supported the channel in any active way, thank you anyway for making it to the end of the video, at least. That helps the algorithm too. Thank you very much for watching. I am Blunty, and I will catch you next time.